Josh Gold, Archery Trade.
Thanks. And I'm not going to talk for more than a second. I'm actually going to turn this over to Jason Schooley with Oklahoma Department of Wildlife and Conservation. He is going to present a topic that's come up recently that I think this group, we will at least introduce the topic and then kind of run from there and have some action items to follow up. So I'm going to turn it right over to him and let him take off.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm happy to be here speaking on behalf of Oklahoma Department of Wildlife and in collaboration with Archery Trade Association. So I'm very grateful that Josh and Jennifer are starting an interesting collaboration with us focused on bow fishing, and particularly bow fishing management and sort of the impacts of this growing sport. So I think it's appropriate that we talk about this in this hunting and shooting sports committee today. It's a sport that is touted as, one of the fastest growing outdoor, shooting sports there are. And, I challenge you to find any article about bow fishing where they don't state something to that effect. And while there's no really robust measures of how the sport is growing, at least none that I've been able to find, just looking at, media reports, of course, the ascendance of big money tournaments, et cetera, it seems that post 2010 has sort of been the expansion phase for bow fishing. And one way to look at that is simply at the US patents filed for bow fishing equipment. In the bottom right figure there, you can see pretty intense growth. Also, in the same time period, Bowfishing Association of America reported a pretty good explosion in membership. Well, just a couple of basics so that we're all on the same page. Of course, bowfishing is simply taking a fish with a bow and arrow rather than a rod and reel. Generally in all states, this is only legal for targeting non-game fish. And so non-game fish actually fall into two serious categories. One, non-native invasive species like the bighead and silver carps, which you may have seen. They're expanding all over the nation. But then, the main focus of what we're talking about today is the native non-game species. And in Oklahoma, those typically comprise the gars, of which we have 4 species, the buffalo fishes, which we have 3 species, and then others, including other suckers and paddlefish. Now, some of the challenges that these native non-game species receive very little management. And so my colleague, Dr. Dennis Scarnecchia from University of Idaho, and I sort of realized that there's not much literature on this subject of bow fishing. However, our observations indicated that it was rapidly growing. So we put together a paper in 2020, which basically laid the foundation, stating, what's the history and status of the sport, what are the potential ecological impacts, and sort of what are the topics that state agencies like Oklahoma Department of Wildlife need to be considering regarding management of those targeted species. As part of that paper, we did a 50-state agency survey. As you can kind of see here, some of the basic facts: bow fishing, of course, legal in all states, but receives very little monitoring and requires only a fishing license for the most part. Nearly half the states indicated that they saw the sport as expanding, although again, not really any good metrics of that. 31 states noted that they did have tournaments, whereas less than a third of those states actually have bow fishing education programs. So that's obviously sort of a weakness in awareness for the sport. And sadly, 0 states indicated that they had management goals or plans specific to bow fishing. Now, many of the states did, however, share some common management concerns with this growing sport, which is targeting native non-game species, as you see the smallmouth buffalo in the bottom right photo. For the most part, those management concerns centered around inadequacies in data. Data not only on the bow fishers, who they are, what is their demographic, how are they interacting with the resource, when and where and how, but also what are they taking, what species, And not only that, but lack of knowledge, life history knowledge about the species being taken. But other concerns such as wanton waste, which is essentially, no beneficial use of shot fish, user conflicts, public perception, or ethics with the sport. But we discuss all these in our paper and sort of talk about what state agency solutions might exist. And we're going to go into a little bit of that as we continue. But bowfishing as a shooting sport and a fishing sport presents several challenges. The first of which is funding, because for the most part, there is no dedicated funding for bowfishing and bowfishing management in the States. And we do have a vibrant wildlife sport fish restoration funding program, the two-tiered program, which the latter of which defines sport fish as aquatic gill-breathing vertebrate animals with paired fins, having material value for recreation in the marine and freshwaters of the United States. However, this sort of collides with many states who actually have state laws which define what is a game fish or a sport fish. And for example, my state of Oklahoma defines game fish as fish normally sought after by sportsmen, and in fact lists them. So this limited list of fish are the only fish that are sport fish. And if they're not on that list, they're by default a non-game fish. Therefore, it's difficult for my state agency to justify spending sport fish restoration dollars on non-game fish. Now, of course, this program is a successful funding model that, for example, archery equipment provides 11% excise tax on, and that funding goes to wildlife restoration. Fishing equipment, hook and line equipment, 10% excise tax goes to sport fish restoration. However, we're talking about bowfishing, which uses archery equipment to shoot fish. So how does that work? Well, as an example, I just kind of plucked this ready-made bowfishing rig from, I think it's Cajun. It's off the shelf, ready to go bowfish. That includes everything you see here: the bow, the arrow, the tip, the reel, the line, etc., retailing approximately $400. Now, just as a funding example or an exercise, of course, that bow includes all these different components. And because it's sold as one unit, it comes with all these. But had you purchased all these pieces of equipment independently, everything but the reel would be contributing to wildlife restoration. And that's unfortunate because this is a purpose-built device made for shooting fish, and it's probably inadequate for hunting terrestrial game. So the purchase of this as a unit probably yields $44 towards wildlife restoration. And I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that funding, but for fisheries managers such as myself, I'd sure like some of that to go towards management and research of the species actually targeted by this equipment. A couple other challenges with bow fishing, we can kind of relate it back to bow hunting again. For terrestrial species, commonly bow hunted, of course, deer, turkey, elk, and then feral swine, males and females are distinguishable in the field by hunters, just visually distinguishable. Of course, antlers and plumage, tusks, etc. The largest trophy targets are males. They typically have short lifespans, broad brush here, but 13 years or fewer, and they have fairly regular annual reproduction, of course, with some exceptions, but fairly short-lived. Now, new research on some of these native non-game species being targeted by bow fishing indicates that, of course, males and females are not necessarily distinguishable in the field in an aquatic environment where they're being shot from a boat or from the shore. However, the largest, oldest trophy targets are females, in great contrast to those large terrestrial targets being males. New research finds that they have longer lifespans, 30 to well over 100 years for bigmouth buffalo, recently published approximately a year ago. And also, research finds that they have inconsistent and episodic reproduction, meaning they have, boom and bust cycles throughout their lifespan, but they live a long time, so the species can persist with, long periods with poor recruitment. So the consequences of where those life history characteristics sort of collide with unregulated take of these species, these native non-game species, can result in age and size truncation, meaning that the largest or the oldest of particular species are taken out by bow fishing. And this has actually been demonstrated in the scientific literature, not only by looking at tournaments, but using bow fishing to collect larger, older age classes within wild stocks. But the major consequence of this actually are the impacts on recruitment. And so there's some research published demonstrating that fish reproductive energy output increases disproportionately with body size. So using the cod as an example, they found that one large, mature, old cod required 37 smaller, younger female cod to replace the reproductive output of that one cod. So highly disproportional. And so for species with episodic recruitment that don't recruit on an annual basis, this is bad if you're shooting all of the old, large females. So it brings up concerns of sustainability. Bringing the terms to my state of Oklahoma, specifically, these native non-game species typically do not have any bag or size limits. So no harvest protections whatsoever, with very few exceptions, For example, species of concern or paddlefish, we regulate heavily. There's also no prohibition of shoot and release, which means that a bowfisher can actually go out, use fish as targets, and immediately throw them back in the water. And there's some ethical concerns with that. And then the only rules we really have to guide disposal of remains. They can bury, burn them, or return them to the reservoir. So bowfishing is a focus of my research at this point, of course, and we just recently completed a statewide bowfishing survey in Oklahoma, finding that over a 2-year span, we saw a 240% increase in estimated participation. Now, that is very significant. Now, it's still a small fraction of our license holders, most of which are using traditional hook and line methods, but some other factoids. Most of those fish are newly recruited, not those fish, those bow fishers are newly recruited to the sport, having bowfished less than 3 years. And those respondents who did not bowfish, a fairly sizable fraction of them are interested in the sport. So that's something to be concerning as far as the growth. Now, we do have vibrant archery education programs, youth programs, and through affiliation with the Archery Trade Association, one component of that is the Explore Bowfishing curriculum. So we do have opportunities to promote conservation ethic for these bowfishers, youths typically, but we of course encourage Oklahoma hunters and anglers to practice personal responsibility, sportsmanship, stewardship by taking responsibility for the animals they choose to kill. Of course, in bowfishing, those are native non-game species primarily. Maintaining possession of those killed animals, so rather than just using them as target practice, throwing them back in the river or lake, to actually maintain possession and dispose of those properly. Demonstrate beneficial use. Hopefully they're eating them or using them in some beneficial way. And when they're not, or they have remains, they need to dispose of them respectfully. So essentially, future steps, it's not all about personal responsibility. We as a state agency have some pretty serious responsibilities as well. We need to learn about bowfishers, which we're doing now in Oklahoma, but I challenge that other states need to be doing this as well. Learn about the species taken. There's kind of a burgeoning effort to look at these native non-game species and understand their life history and what the potential impacts of these high harvest sport is. We need to lead by example as state agencies in upgrading the social status of these native non-game species. They're worth more than just target practice. They do play ecological roles, and we need to make sure that our licensed buyers understand that. And of course, like all fisheries, we need to provide sustainable bowfishing opportunities to recruit licensed buyers and make sure that we're providing those opportunities that are healthy for our natural resources. But of course, we have shared responsibilities with the industry and the agency. And so it's important that we're pairing with Archery Trade Association to try to promote a bowfishing conservation ethic, which is aligned with the North American model of fish and wildlife conservation. So we're in the infancy of modifying the Explore Bowfishing curriculum and trying to enhance it to sort of update it with the current knowledge of the life history of these targeted species and how the sport can be practiced more judiciously and carefully. And then, of course, as I implied, there's some funding challenges that we need agencies and the industry to sort of focus on enhancing or modifying those funding streams, the Wildlife Sport Fish Restoration Program, to accommodate stock assessment of native non-game fishes. As we demonstrated, a lot of the equipment excise taxes are not going to the appropriate destination. So I hope that we can sort of, this presentation, if continues the conversation or exposes some of you to some of the challenges with bow fishing. And I invite you to check out not only our scientific paper, but we have, a more approachable, popular article that we put in our Oklahoma Outdoor magazine. All those are available by request through ResearchGate or just simply by Googling. But our survey report is being reviewed by our administration and it'll be available quite soon. So feel free to email me and I'll type my email address into the chat for people. So thank you for your time and I entertain any questions.
Anyone have any questions for Jason or Josh?
And thank you, Jason. I just want to throw it out there that this is the start of a conversation. We just recently had this. And so we will, we welcome input. We welcome discussions, questions, comments, all that to work on this. We are going to bring this up at a meeting at our trade show in January with some of our manufacturers around this. So this is a continued conversation. So if you have anything about this, please reach out to us and let us know.
Jason, just curious, people bow fishing in Oklahoma just need a fishing license?
Yes, sir.
Anyone else?